Welcome back. I want to start today with a number and a direction, miles south. That is the distance between Key West, Florida, and the island of Cuba. 90 miles of open water. It is the shortest gap between the United States and one of the most complicated geopolitical relationships in American history. In 1990, a president sent 20 Cuban exiles across that water to topple a government. It failed completely. It became one of the most embarrassing moments in modern American foreign policy. History knows it as the Bay of Pigs. In Fidui, those same TGU miles became the center of the most dangerous D-Days the world has ever experienced. Soviet nuclear missiles pointed at American cities, fine miles from Florida. The Cuban Missile Crisis came within a hair of ending civilization as we know it. Now, in the spring of 2010, those Sundine miles are in the news again, and this time, the president is not trying to be subtle about it. Here is the sequence of events that brought us here, because nothing about the current Cuba crisis happened in isolation. On January 3, the United States conducted a military operation in Venezuela. It resulted in the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and the effective transfer of control over Venezuela's oil reserves to the United States. The operation was called Absolute Resolve. Venezuela had been Cuba's primary oil supplier. For years, Caracas sent subsidized fuel north to Havana, keeping the Cuban economy on life support. When Maduro fell, that lifeline was severed overnight. 18 days later, on January 7, President Trump signed Executive Order 20. It authorized additional tariffs on imports from any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. In practical terms, this was an oil blockade, not just cutting off Venezuela, threatening any nation that tried to fill the gap. The result on the island has been catastrophic nationwide blackouts. Critical fuel shortages, severe scarcity of basic goods. In March of this year, Cuba recorded its highest number of protests in a single month since the famous July Santoin demonstrations. Cubans are banging pots in the streets. They are blockading roads. In some places, they have attacked local Communist Party offices. The Cuban government describes itself as a besieged state. President Miguel Diaz-Canel has said publicly that he will not step down, but he has also told the Cuban people to be prepared for the possibility of a U.S. invasion. And then, on April 7th, Donald Trump said this in public. After we finish with Iran, he said, "We may stop by Cuba." Stop by Cuba. The Pentagon is now actively ramping up contingency planning for military operations in Cuba should the president give the order. Multiple outlets have confirmed this. The planning is not hypothetical. It is active preparation for a real possibility. So let us be honest about what we are looking at. The United States has already demonstrated in Frenchwind that it is willing to conduct direct military operations against sovereign governments in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela happened. It was fast, it was decisive, and by most accounts, the Trump administration considers it a success. But Venezuela does not fully explain why Cuba specifically is now in the crosshairs. There is something that has received far less coverage than it deserves, and it changes the picture considerably. The U.S. State Department has reported to Congress that there are significant indicators that the Cuban government has tolerated, and in some cases actively facilitated, the movement of up to 9 Cuban nationals to fight for Russia in the war in Ukraine. Cuban fighters, recruited through Cuban government channels, serving in Russian military units, in a war that the United States is actively supporting on the other side. This is not just about a communist government 20 miles from Florida that the exile community has wanted to see fall for 6 decades. This is about Cuba functioning as an active node in Russia's military network, at a moment when the United States and Russia are on opposite sides of a live shooting war in Europe. That is a different kind of threat, and it is the reason the phrase "stop by Cuba" is considerably harder to read as idle bluster than it might otherwise seem. Cuba is next on the list. Now here is what I want you to think carefully about, because this is where the historical memory matters. The Bay of Pigs failed for a very specific reason. It was not just poor execution, it was the assumption that once American-backed forces landed on Cuban soil, the Cuban population would immediately rise up and join them. That assumption was wrong. Castro had genuine popular support, at least among enough of the population to hold. The exile brigade was captured. Kennedy was humiliated, and the episode pushed Cuba directly into the arms of the Soviet Union, which led 1 year later to nuclear missiles 100 miles from Florida. The lesson that most military historians drew from the Bay of Pigs was not just tactical, it was strategic. You cannot plan a regime change operation based on the assumption that the population will automatically rally to your side once you show up. That is not how it works. Fast forward to Simbai. The United States invaded Iraq with a similar assumption. That once Saddam Hussein fell, Iraqis would welcome a new order. What followed was nearly 2 decades of war, civil conflict, and a destabilization that the entire Middle East is still living with today. Now the Trump administration is looking at Cuba, a country with a 30-year-old revolutionary government. A country where the Communist Party controls every institution. A country where the protests happening right now are real and growing, but where organized opposition capable of filling a power vacuum simply does not exist. The question I keep coming back to is, what is the plan for the day after Venezuela had oil? The United States had an economic rationale for intervention and a cleaner post-operation framework. Cuba is a different calculation entirely. It has a larger population, a more deeply embedded party structure, and a geography that puts it 50 miles from America's most politically significant swing state. There is also a specific consequence of Cuban political collapse that deserves to be named directly. In 720, the Cuban government briefly opened the port of Mariel for emigration. In the months that followed, more than 20,000 Cuban refugees arrived in South Florida. The Mariel boat lift overwhelmed Miami, overwhelmed the state, and became a defining crisis for the Carter administration, contributing directly to his loss of Florida that November. Today, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has already publicly warned about the risk of a new mass migration event on a similar or greater scale. He has called the prospect unacceptable and deployed state maritime resources to monitor the coastline. But here is the honest math. Cuba has 4 million people. The Puerto Mariel exodus was less than 20% of the island's population. If the Cuban government collapses without a clear successor structure, there is no ceiling on how large a migration event could become. The aftermath of a military operation in Cuba does not stay in Cuba, it comes north, into a state that has shaped the outcome of multiple American presidencies and whose governor is already treating the coastline as a front line against the next migration wave. And yet the planning is happening. The rhetoric is escalating. And there is, as far as anyone in Washington can tell, no serious congressional debate about this. That last point is the one I want to linger on. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia has raised the alarm. He is pushing for legislation that would require congressional authorization before any military action against Cuba. He is arguing correctly that under the Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not to the president. Historically, this has not stopped American presidents from acting. From the Gulf of Tonkin to Iraq, the executive branch has found ways to move first and ask for authorization later, or sometimes never ask at all. But the scale of what is being discussed here deserves a real congressional debate. A military operation in Cuba is not a drone strike. It is not a targeted raid. If the United States is seriously considering the kind of intervention that could topple the Cuban government, it needs a plan for what comes next. It needs to reckon with the reality that Cuba and the United States share a fundamental stretch of water, not a semi-mile ocean. The aftermath lands on America's doorstep. Part of the reason there is so little congressional debate about this is that the political terms of Cuba policy have been set for 6 decades by one of the most influential constituencies in the country. The Cuban exile community in Florida has driven this relationship since before most Americans living today were born. That community has legitimate grievances. Many of them lost everything to the Castro Revolution. Many of them have family members who were imprisoned or killed. Their desire to see the Cuban government fall is deeply personal and deeply understandable, but wanting a government to fall and having a workable plan for what replaces it are two very different things. The window between those two things is where American military adventures have historically gone wrong. Here's where things stand today. Cuba is in genuine crisis. The blockade is working in the narrow sense that it is making life on the island increasingly unbearable. The question is whether unbearable conditions produce the political result Washington wants, or whether they produce the thing that has historically followed episodes of extreme external pressure on authoritarian governments. Not collapse, but consolidation, nationalism, and a population that blames the outside power for its suffering. Díaz-Canel is not Maduro. Venezuela had a fractured military and a deeply divided political elite. Cuba's institutions, while weakened, are more coherent. And Cuba has been under American pressure for 20 years. It has developed a kind of siege mentality that is politically durable in ways that Venezuela's was not. The preliminary diplomatic talks that have reportedly taken place between the two governments are not about normalization. Both sides have been clear about that. They are, at best, about preventing an immediate humanitarian catastrophe from becoming something much worse. There is also a complication to the oil blockade that deserves to be said plainly. Russia has been delivering fuel to Cuba, framing the shipments as humanitarian aid. Moscow is absorbed in Ukraine and has limited capacity to provide Cuba with serious military or economic support. But the fuel deliveries are not symbolic. They keep a partial channel open, and they give the Havana government a narrative to offer its own population. We are surviving, with Russian support against American aggression. A blockade that is rhetorically absolute but operationally porous is a particular kind of problem. It inflicts maximum suffering on ordinary Cubans while simultaneously handing the government exactly the propaganda frame it needs to consolidate domestic support. If the goal is regime change through economic pressure, a porous blockade may achieve the worst of both outcomes: enough pain to radicalize the population, not enough to produce collapse. So here is my question for you. We have been in this movie before. The pattern of American intervention premised on the assumption that the population will welcome us, that the aftermath is manageable, that this time will be different. Is this time different? Does the combination of a genuine popular uprising in Cuba, an already weakened government, and a dramatically escalated pressure campaign from Washington add up to a moment where intervention might actually produce the outcome we want? Or is this the moment where 30 miles becomes, once again, the most dangerous stretch of water in the world? Drop your answer in the comments. Because this conversation needs to happen somewhere, and it is clearly not happening in Congress yet.